Hello, this is Andrew with Missing Remote, and this is a Hubitat Elevation hub. This is the C-7 model, although you wouldn't know it by looking at the box because it doesn't say that anywhere in the box, which is unfortunate because if you were to pick this up at retail, you would want to know that you're getting the C-7 version and not the C-5 version. The C-5 is the older version. This obviously is the newer version. It's supposed to be a nice upgrade over the 5. The biggest difference here is that the 5 has an older Z-Wave chip set inside of it, whereas this one has the newest one that supports, you can see here, C7, that supports S2 security. And I'm also hoping that it will solve a performance issue that I have currently with my home automation system. It's not a big performance issue. Sometimes it just takes a couple seconds for a light to turn on when the motion sensor activates it, and then other times it just works the way that it's supposed to. I'm hoping that this is a little bit faster, and hopefully that sorts that problem out. Inside the box we have a quick start guide, micro USB cable, power supply, USB-A power supply, and this is probably an Ethernet cable. Yes, okay. On the device itself, 100 megabit Ethernet, micro USB power. This combo makes it really, really easy if you have PoE in your house to use power over Ethernet with this device because of this micro USB. You can get, obviously there are lots of other PoE injectors, but the micro USB ones are super easy to find. You don't have to worry about barrel plug sizes and all that other stuff, and they're relatively cheap. You can get a gigabit micro USB PoE adapter for like $10 to $15. So that makes it really easy to put this in the best location, which is usually in the center of your house.
So I've been using this C7 hub for several months now. Before we get into the why I've been using it for several months before actually doing this review, let's walk through the features and functionality of the device through their web interface. All of the basic functionality pivots around these options on the left side here. You know, where you see rooms and devices and dashboards, and we'll walk through each one of these in some detail. So let's just start with rooms. So this is a relatively new concept for Hubitat. If you're using the Hubitat by itself and not with other ecosystems, I can see how this would be useful. Back in the day when I first started doing home automation stuff with a different controller, a Vera controller, organizing objects or devices into the rooms that they were in was a useful thing. At this point, while I created a room, you can see, I don't know that it's terribly useful to go through this exercise in Hubitat. Rooms as concept in home automation are very critical. So don't take away the wrong thing. But where they're critical, at least for how I use a home automation controller now, is through assistants that interact with the controller, like an Alexa device or a Google Home device, where you can do things like you can walk in a room and say, Alexa, turn on the lights, or Alexa, turn off the lights, or do things like that. And that's where rooms are key, but I'm not sure why you would want to organize your devices inside a Hubitat into rooms. Maybe there's a reason for that. I just haven't discovered it, because for the most part, I don't really interact with devices directly through the Hubitat home automation controller. I interact with them either in an automated way, like when the door unlocks, lights turn on, or when the door has been closed for some amount of time, 10 minutes in the case that in my rules, they lock themselves. That's the power of home automation, is that the house does things. It automates itself for you. You don't really interact. You don't have to interact directly with the devices. And when you do want to interact with them, it's through a third-party controller like the Google Home or the Amazon Alexa. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit more detail. So I'm not going to get into the integration with those voice control assistant things right now. Let's have a look at the devices. Hubitat supports a wide array of different devices, Z-Wave, Zigbee, IP. You can do pretty much anything that you want to interact with from a home automation perspective. You can do it inside of Hubitat, either natively through the drivers that they provide, or through drivers that are provided by the community, or if you want to, you can write your own drivers. This is an example. I'm just going to dig into my Presence device. This is a virtual device. And the way that this works, and this is kind of an interesting thing, just digging in here, we use Presence to drive the different modes. You can see here there's the mode manager and it says day, because obviously I'm home. If I were to go away for some amount of time, the mode would flip to away, and then different automations would happen than in the mode where we're home. Like, for example, if we're away, all the doors automatically get locked. The garage door gets closed. Certain lights get turned off. This is not something, the virtual presence device is part of Hubitat. Driving Presence, in this case, is not part of Hubitat. I had to do something in order to make that happen. In this case, that doing something is, I wrote a Node app that works with my Unify controller to detect when people's phones are online. And then it calls these devices via the Maker API, this thing here, to set the presence. There's a post on Missing Remote around how to do this, what you need to set up, and all of that. And this is one of those things that is just, it's really cool that you can do this inside of, or with Hubitat to drive that. Now, it's quite possible that I could have written an app that did that for me, but since I have it was just easier for me to write it in Node.js and host it on a virtual machine in my environment than it was to try to figure out how to do it inside of Hubitat. Of course, there are just, generic lights. This is just a generic Z-Wave light. And then, you can do the things to see what the state of it is, change variables, and there's not a whole lot to this. Obviously, it's part of my Google Home and my Amazon Alexa ecosystem so that I can control it and say things like, turn off anti-closet light or turn on anti-closet light. Those are the Amazon and Google things are apps, and we'll get to them in just a moment. So let's go to a dashboard. I don't use these that much. They are pin protected because I expose these through the internet, through Hubitat's proxy service, so that I can use them on my phone when I'm not at home. But when I'm home, I don't really ever use the dashboards. They provide a much more useful way to interact with devices, because when I showed going into the closet light, in order to interact with the device, you have to load the UI, find the device, then load the device, then turn it on or turn it off or see what the status is. Here in the dashboard, obviously the dashboard makes that a lot easier, and you can see, is the back door locked, is the front door locked, what's the mode at home, these other things that are very useful in a high-level way. I just don't use it that often because I don't tend to directly interact with the devices in my home. Apps are in many ways similar to the concept of a scene in other home automation controller ecosystems, although it's not really correct to just limit it to scenes. We have the Amazon Alexa skill, which is an app. We have the Google Home app, which allows us to interact or to add all of the devices to what you want to the list of devices that you want to control using your Google Home devices. Now, there are some limits around that, like security devices, doors, door locks cannot be voice driven directly, but there are ways to get around that using virtual devices and scenes and things like that. If anybody's interested in how to do that, just let me know, and I can show you how to do that. There's yeah, this is just where all of these devices are, or this is where all the apps are. There's so many things that you can do with Hubitat, it's difficult to dig into each one of these things, so I'm just going to highlight some of the things that I use the most. So like here's where you enable the dashboards, or how you manage the dashboards. Hubitat Safety Monitor. So if you have an alarm system, you can integrate it with the Hubitat Safety Monitor. Let's just look at that. But I mostly use this for monitoring for water, for leaks and things like that around the dish, or around the washing machine and in the sump pump. Lock Code Manager is a nice way that if you have multiple door locks, it's really easy to just set all the door locks to the same code for the same people. Basically, you just manage them at a person level and then push them out to your door locks. That's a really key one. Maker API is another cool one if you want to interact with devices on the Hubitat via a REST API or HTTP API. You have to specifically enable the devices within it, so it's a level of security that some other home automation controllers don't provide, like the Vera. Basically, if you're on the same network, you can do pretty much anything with a Vera via the REST API. Mode Manager automates the selection of modes, so you can do certain things based on, you can write automations based on the mode, and we'll dig into that in a second here when we dig into an automation that controls the locking of doors. Motion and mode lighting apps is a neat feature, basically, which allows you to, it makes writing automations to turn lights on and turn them off much easier. So if we go to, let's just look at the basement stairs one. So basically when you walk, I have two motion sensors, one at the top of the stairs, one at the bottom of the stairs. When either one of those triggers, it turns the stairs light on. And then if no motion is detected after 2 minutes, it turns the light off, which you could certainly do this using a scene, a rule engine in Hubitat worlds. That's a rule, but this makes motion and mode lighting apps makes writing those scenes or rules much easier because you don't have to do all of that plumbing. It just kind of does that for you. So let's take a look at, we'll look at the Lock the Back Door 4.0. So there have been various iterations of the rule engine. 4.0 is the most recent version, I believe. Some of these rules I migrated, and when we talk about migration, we'll get into some of that a little bit more. You used to write rules much differently than you do now. It used to be about truths and conditions, and now it's more about events. If you're used to writing condition-based rules, writing event-based rules is quite a bit different. It's a wholly different mindset, but event-based rules make more sense because home automation is about events. Something happens and I want this other thing to happen. So I'm glad that they did it, but I wish they had done it sooner. Now I have a bunch of rules that were written in the old way, and I don't want to rewrite them. But you don't have to. They continue to work. They just work off of that truth-based engine. So this is my lock the back door rule. Looking at how I would write this, it runs off of events. In this case, when the back door is closed, or when the back door is open, because I need to be able to cancel the locking if the door is being opened and closed repeatedly. So basically what this rule does is you open the door, you close the door. If nobody opens the door within 10 minutes, it locks itself. So we have this structured rule. And this is something I love about Hubitat, is that they have this conditional logic writing tool where you can write really complicated, I mean, this is just a little bit complicated, but you can write really complicated rules using if-then logic is so much easier than it is with some of the other home automation systems that I've looked at, where you have conditional logic, where you don't have to go straight from a simple, straightforward, scene-based, you can only do very limited amount of things, you can only do a very limited amount of checks, to straight into the code where you have to know things like JavaScript or Lua or something. This is pseudocode where you can write really complicated conditional rules without knowing a programming language, and you just use their tool to do this. And obviously this is not a super complicated rule, but it is relatively complicated. It would be difficult to write this kind of rule without using code on other platforms that I've looked at. Where here there's a tool. We'll just click in here. We can see, this tool where you just kind of, select certain things to build the rule set. And I love that. I absolutely love that about Hubitat. There's also simple automation rules, which in this case, I pretty much just use them for time-based or mode-based reaction. So in this scenario, I just turn on a bunch of lights when evening happens. And evening happens is defined, or the mode manager flips to evening based on sunset. So it's like 30 minutes before sunset, it flips to evening, so the lights go on around the house. So let's look at the settings. This is where you kind of look at basic stuff around the state of the Hubitat. You can check for updates. You can shut down the hub. You can restart the hub. You can download your backups. Backups are a touchy subject because while you get something, you don't really get a backup because it doesn't store radio information for your Z-Wave devices, which means that if your hub goes sideways or you buy a new hub, you have to unpair and repair all of your Z-Wave devices. If you have 5 devices, probably not a big deal. If you have 86 Z-Wave devices, that becomes a real pain. And it's one of the things that I find most frustrating with the Hubitat ecosystem is that the backup isn't a backup. It stores your rules, and then there's a very convoluted process by which you can recover, mostly, from an upgrade or a catastrophic event. Hubitat has addressed this somewhat with their subscription service. I have not opted in the subscription service yet. I may well do that. As part of their subscription service, you can now pay them to take a proper backup of your hub so that you can restore your devices in the event of a catastrophic hub failure, or you pay them money to upgrade your hub. It seems unduly harsh to me. I'm not sure exactly how to frame this because I completely understand that they need to figure out some way to get recurring revenue. And I'm not sure how to make that happen for them. But it just feels so harsh to say, you need to pay us to make a backup a real backup. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's other features in the subscription, but yeah, not a fan of that. But, I'll probably end up paying them because paying them like $10 a year or whatever it is, to not have to recover, to manually walk around and reset every Z-Wave device I own and repair it is probably worth it. Apps are where you would add custom apps. We can look at the text-to-speech device where basically it just creates all these text-to-speech devices. You do have to do some other stuff to make this work, so I'm not going to go into this. This is a relatively complicated thing that I hardly ever use anymore. Drivers, or this is where you would import custom drivers to do stuff with your hub. So just dig into one of these. You can see that this is code, and this is the driver that defines how it's going to interact with this Z-Wave device, what parameters it supports, and all of that other stuff. If you know what you're doing, these are relatively easy to work with and to create, and they exist on other platforms so that I think SmartThings uses the same basic structure as Hubitat for their drivers. So a lot of times you can just take a SmartThings driver, change some stuff, and then import it straight up into here for devices that aren't supported directly. We'll look at the logs. It's just, different system events. This is where you can see that the mode changed. You can see that the mode changed. Look at our runtime stats. I don't know that I've ever really dug into the runtime stats before. That's not terribly useful, but what is terribly useful is the logs. And this is, if you're having issues with your automations, you can turn on high levels of logging. I just go to past logs. You can see all of these devices that are what's going on. You can flip into it and see, oh, looks like my garage door opener has a low battery. I should probably do something about that. When it's open, when it's closed, it's very useful for debugging and figuring out what's going on. So before moving on, let's take a look at a slightly more complicated rule. This is, so I had some trouble with, I want to call it a load balancer, but it's actually, I think it's called a sump pump alternator. So basically I have 3 sump pumps in my basement because we have a very deep basement and we live in a swamp, or what used to be a swamp. The alternator broke. I got water in the basement. I got frustrated with that and I didn't want to buy a new alternator. So I bought 2 Zeus heavy duty appliance Z-Wave modules, and I wrote a rule and a multi-sensor relay to track when track the water levels in the 2 pits that we have in the basement, and then toggle between the 2 sump pumps in the main pit and send alerts and log when water gets to certain levels. And so that this part here, the get request, is the logging part where it sends status around what sump pump is getting switched to. The event is when the low water float turns on, which actually means that it goes up. It flips the pumps. And we should never get into a state where one of the pumps isn't on, so I'm not sure what to do about this. But just in case, it actually logs the not good state. And then this is the other rule. And I made a video around this, which is because there's 3 different sensors in the relay, I can do 3 different actions. And this is the one that sends a message to the Google Home Assistant that says, check the sump pump because the pit is high. So there's an actionable event here. And then this one is the 3rd relay sensor that basically just logs the fact that water has gotten into the backup pit, so that I can track this and see, are my sump pumps working well? Do I need to make them bigger? That kind of stuff. Now, I obviously could have done all of this before with the old alternator, but it failing was the impetus to write all of this stuff that I need to write and to set up all of this stuff to say, to know when water's getting in the 2nd pit, to know when my sump pumps are flipping, when one of them isn't quite ready to cope with the load in the main pit. So these are things that you can do with home automation that just are really, really powerful and really, really cool. But this is also a great segue into the next thing I want to talk about. Notice down here, it says that this is running on my C5. And the reason why it's running on my C5 and the reason why it's taken me several months to do this review or to do this follow-up review thing is that the C7 hub was not very stable for a very long time. Recently, it has been very stable. So I think that Hubitat has sorted all of this stuff out. But it's May right now. I bought the C7 in December, and there were long periods of time where I just didn't have home automation on for any device that was on the C7, which was the majority of my devices, and it was really, really frustrating. Some of that was because of some Zeus modules, some Zeus Z-Wave modules. But most of it was because the C7 just wasn't ready for a production environment. I think that has been corrected. It has been stable for about a month now. I haven't had any problems with it for about a month, but I'm still not quite ready to say I want to put something as important as keeping water out of my basement on the C7 hub. So take that for what it's worth. If you have a C5 hub, I would not recommend moving to a C7 hub. Functionally, they're relatively the same. I had hoped that the C7 hub would fix some of the performance issues that I have been seeing had been seeing with my C5 hub, where I walk. So like in the example of my basement motion sensor, most basement stairs motion sensor, I walk through the door, I can see the light flash on the motion sensor triggering the light, but the light doesn't turn on. And then a few seconds later, the light turns on. But the light doesn't turn on immediately. It takes a few seconds for the light to turn on, sometimes. Most of the time, it works the way it's supposed to. I open the door, I walk in and see the light, boom, it comes on. But often enough, there is lag in the system, and I don't know why that is. It's possible that the system is just overloaded with those truth-based scenes or rules, and that's part of why they moved to event-based rules or scenes, was to reduce that underlying load on the system. I don't know. And maybe if I rewrote all those rules from truth to event, that problem would fix itself. But it's frustrating. And it's frustrating enough that I'm not super pleased with it. But given all, I don't want you to take the wrong thing away from that. Given all of the other features of the Hubitat environment, I love it. And I would not go back to Vera, and I wouldn't look at another system because it does 98% of what I wanted to do. I'm just not super pleased with performance, the responsiveness all the time with how the rules run for motion lighting. Migration, as I mentioned, is a hot mess. There's not much else to say because I already covered it. If you're moving hubs, it sucks unless you pay the money to give you a real backup. Another thing that isn't terribly awesome is the support infrastructure. Support is mostly best effort. It's hard for me to be too critical on Hubitat for this because it's a small company. Even larger companies have moved to this model. Support's expensive. Having people who know what they're doing is expensive. And so a lot of companies have adopted a community support-based model, which isn't awesome for end users. But I'm not sure what the alternative is. But it's just something you need to be aware of. When you're buying into this ecosystem, people at Hubitat will support you. It will just take a while. And sometimes the support comes down to, would you like to try some beta firmware? Because maybe that'll fix it. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it makes the situation worse. It's just a thing. Personally, I am totally cool with that because, one, the hubs aren't that expensive. And I understand that Hubitat, the people who are running Hubitat are passionate and invested in their platform, and they will do everything they can to make it right eventually. So you just have to be comfortable with that. If you want something that is more than that, this probably isn't the right platform for you. But I'm not sure what platform you would want to go for, because a lot of other companies are essentially in the same boat. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I hope that was useful. I know that's not a ringing endorsement, but for me, I am enthusiastic about the platform. I am very supportive of the platform and what Hubitat as a company and what the folks who run Hubitat are trying to do. But it's clearly not the device for everyone. That has to be said and hammered home. It is not the device for everyone. It is an amazing device, and it does 98% of what I want it to do. And I love the fact that I can walk into a room and interact with my lights and the objects, the devices in that room, using my Google Home, which between us, given the choice between the Amazon ecosystem and the Google Home ecosystem, I think the Google Home ecosystem is tons better, at least with Hubitat. I've been moving away from the Amazon. We still have it. We started with that. But I think that Amazon, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I think Amazon's home automation ecosystem has become stagnant in some ways, and in other ways has become very focused on their own stuff. Too focused on their own stuff for me to like the way that it works more generally. And the Google Home environment ecosystem has not only continued to get better, but also works amazingly well with Hubitat. So if you have to choose between the two, I would say Google Home. Anyway, tangent over. I believe I was saying that it's not the right device for everyone. If you like to tinker, this is amazing. If you're technical, this is amazing. If you just want to drop something in place and not mess with it and not have to understand how to write more complicated rules with more complicated logic, this might not be the right platform for you. You can do amazing things with it, but you do need to put more work into it than you might have to put into other platforms. I hope that was useful, and I hope that was a reasonably complete look at the platform, what you can do with it, its features and functionality. If you want me to dive into any more of these features, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to do that. This is really long, and I didn't want to get too far into the weeds, but there is just so much you can do with the platform that this overview probably doesn't do the whole platform justice. So, drop them below. Anyway, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, all that jazz. Cheers.